pretty much everyone in the profession of, be it process management, project management, program management, business analysis, we all know how to deliver good projects, but we just don't do it.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process. Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each of these episodes, we have the absolute privilege of sitting down with process professionals, process practitioners, those that are putting the art of business process management into organizations on a day-to-day basis. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, a warm welcome to you. We've been going for over 150 episodes now, and we've got interviews from people from all different walks, all different types of organizations, all different areas of focus, all different subject matter experts and things like that. So there's a wide range of episodes and conversations for you to glean from if this is your first time. And if you've been listening to us for some time and you've been enjoying the conversations, and I hope you are enjoying them as much as I enjoy participating in them, I'd encourage you to give us a rating, give us a like, give us a review on any of the platforms. It's just going to help us continue to promote these conversations, promote the topic of business process management, and that's what it's all really about. And I received some feedback or had a conversation with someone not too long ago, a couple of weeks back, and they were in quite a large organization, couple of thousand people here, which in Australian standards is quite large. And they were working in the process space, or are working in the process space. And she was saying, Daniel, I was about to leave business process management because my organization was struggling to understand the idea and the approach and what we should be doing, and I really didn't have many people out there that understood that I could sort of bounce ideas off or collaborate with. I kind of felt a little bit isolated in this field. And then I stumbled across your podcast, and there's 150 other practitioners there that are facing the same challenges, getting some wins there, implementing and adopting business process management across their organization. And now she's decided to, I'm going to stick with it. I'm going to stay in this field. I do love this field. I found my people. And that's really encouraging for us to hear about the impact that this podcast is making. So again, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm equally excited for today's conversation. I get to sit down with Philipp Joebges again for a second time. So we did have a conversation not too far back, but we have had a conversation before. So please, if you enjoyed this conversation, go and have a look at that one. But Phil is the director at KOM Consulting, KOM Consulting. So I'd encourage you to go check him out on LinkedIn and please connect with him. Phil, I'm very excited for this conversation. Thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me again. Yeah, keen to chat a bit more.
So I know that in your history, you've done a lot of work and you've worked with many different organizations. I know some people, you'll find them stick with an organization for number of years, even some decades, and working in the one organization, and then they have that kind of experience and that perspective. And I know for yourself, you've been able to work across many different industries, across many different organizations, and really have quite a diverse and broad experience and perspective, which I think brings a lot of value there, because you can apply things that are working really well and apply them in different contexts and things like that. But I think one big topic that people struggle with is the effective project delivery, I think, is one topic. And we were talking about this just a little bit before, about how people can they can come up with these grandiose ideas about what the goal is, what the outcome is, what we're hoping to achieve. But oftentimes things will fall down in the project delivery element. So let's kick things off there. Why do you think that is? Where do you think, or why do you think projects fall down? Where do you think it is that causes projects to fall down most frequently?
Yeah, I absolutely think that's a big issue, and unfortunately has been a big issue for probably a decade now or so. So all of us would remember quotes along the lines of 80-90% of all transformations fail and so on and so forth. And for some reason, we don't seem to be getting much better at it over time. I think that we have all the right tools and frameworks and approaches out there. I think that pretty much everyone in the profession of, be it process management, project management, program management, business analysis, we all know how to deliver good projects, but we just don't do it. So why don't we just do it? And I think it's usually a combination of pressure from executives. So, hey, here's a big budget, right? Stand up your project, but I need you to go and really quickly demonstrate to me that you have done something. So we've had a project that we were involved in, and actually still are involved in at the moment, that was kicked off about 6 months ago. Big SAP implementation, and for some reason SAP implementations seem to be back on vogue at the moment. A lot of companies doing them, but they had a very clear timeline for the finishing of the first phase of the program of work. And so by having that timeline already agreed, already committed to the steering committee, to the executives, that pressure starts to build. So when pressure starts to build, then what tends to happen is that we start to take shortcuts, and we don't stick to those routines, to those frameworks that we know, in theory that works, but in practice, I just can't do it right now. You might have to go and work with an external vendor. So now you have an idea in a framework, and you need to compare that to the vendor's idea and framework. Or you might say, hey, vendor, I just want you to come in and do everything. So that's in the context of the SAP implementation, that's your classic functional breakdown of the technology and your functional view of business processes. And you then try to shoehorn the organization into this vendor framework. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I think this combination of pressure by defined and committed timelines often leads to us then having to take shortcuts. And it leads to us also thinking that we cannot possibly do good, rigid work in the time frame that we have. Well, maybe we can. So maybe it's time for us to then step outside of what we would call best practices and still remember that we need to somehow get from the idea of, hey, let's implement SAP, to what we would call the conceptual design of, where do our modules sit, which part of the organization is impacted, who are the key stakeholders, what are some of those key changes we want to make across HR, finance, and so on. So I think that's absolutely a big issue there. And the other one that seems to be very topical at the moment as well is just that budgets get cut down. So you might have a certain budget of, call it $1 million at the beginning of the project. You get a couple of months in, and then there's a rationalization across the whole portfolio. So you might have to return $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 back into the budget. So now you're posed with the question of, well, how can you deliver if you've got less budget, less resources? And unfortunately, some of the skills around process management, process improvement, and analysis tend to be the ones that then get caught up in that budget cut as well. It is much less often change management or project management. So those disciplines seem to be much better embedded in organizations. Personally, I do still strongly think and feel that if we do not have the skill sets around process business analysis in project delivery, then we will always have issues. There's something that I tend to say to the guys that work for me quite a bit, and it is a bit on the nose, and it's not necessarily 100% true, but it kind of goes to the heart of what I'm thinking, and that is that a lack of project governance has rarely caused a project to fail, but a lack of process analysis, a lack of business analysis will cause your project to fail. You might kind of get through the first couple of stage gates, you might get to talking to a vendor, starting to look at a system implementation, but at some point you're going to notice that something is missing and that the system, whether it's SAP or a smaller tool, just isn't quite working for you. And especially when we then start to roll in quite human heavy changes together with that. So whether that's a process change, a restructure, a change in responsibilities, that is really when we need to have some good skill sets that people like us tend to bring to the table. So long one answer, but I think it is pressure by timelines, cutting off budgets, and unfortunately that still our types of skill sets probably are less valued than some of the other disciplines like change and project management.
And why would you say that? Why would you say that process-centric approach isn't prioritized as highly?
I think we're not good at communicating what it is about and why we need it. So really important to acknowledge that a process-centric approach is not a silver bullet. It's going to help solve some of these issues, but it's not going to help solve all of the issues. So if then I'm standing here, I'm going to, let's say, the customer with the SAP implementation, I'm trying to flog my process-centric approach, then that all makes sense for me and from the perspective that I'm bringing to the table. But the program is somewhere completely else. They've got different thinking, different concerns. They need to work out the budget, they need to work out the scope of the tool, they need to work out the resourcing. So the questions that they've got on their mind are much less about the actual day-to-day delivery of the project than maybe some of those more overarching questions. And naturally, a process-centric approach cannot necessarily help with some of those questions either. So what I personally like to do is to then say, hey, I acknowledge you've got a lot going on at the moment. So how about you go and focus on that? And how about we go and we focus on the delivery? Because that gives us a little bit of freedom to then go and execute the right approach. Whereas if at every step along the way, we need to try and convince people, then that's a very poor starting position. It should never be that we need to convince somebody to follow our ideas and our approach and our grandiose vision, but it should always be empathy driven, right? Where are you at? What do you need? And how can I best connect to that? And that is when then the good conversation start.
That's fantastic. And I think it's going to help us go a lot further, a lot faster if we have that perspective of, well, where are they at? Let's put myself in their shoes for a moment. What are the things that they care about? What's going to move the needle for them? What keeps them up at night? What language are they using? What terminology are they most familiar with? Because I think that sometimes as practitioners, we can be very, very well aware of our area and our scope of expertise, but not everyone resonates with that. Not everyone relates to that that sort of topic and that concept there. But understanding where are they coming from and what's going to be important for them.
Absolutely, and neither should they, right? If they bring us on board, then I do still feel that there is a big obligation on us as professionals to make it as easy as possible for everyone else. So that there always is going to be an aspect of building capability and building maturity in organizations, and people and culture are a huge part of that. But it's probably not where I would start. But if in the beginning you can start with pain relief, that's great. And let's do that really well. And then let's start to push the boundaries. Because if we do pain relief well, then all of those people we talked about before, right? Your program managers, your business leaders, your executives, they will start to value us. So go, hey, Daniel is on board, Philipp is on board. These guys, they just really helped me out here. Now I'm willing to listen to what they have to say. Which is really important in project rescue as well. So project rescue, right? It's this classic cases where projects have been going on for 6 or 12 months. They just haven't really delivered anything on the chopping board already. And you come in to try and help save the project. We had that case just a couple of months ago. And really, if we would have come in and started to talk about, oh, you should have really used a process-centric approach, then it doesn't really matter, right? Nobody's really interested in that. But what they are interested in is they've just lost 6 or 12 months worth of investment and have nothing to show for. So now the executives are saying, what's going on, guys, right? You've got a couple more weeks, a couple more months. We really need to turn this around. So what we then tend to do is we actually go way back to the very beginning to try and employ that process business analysis approach and bring that rigid approach back in. But you don't have to communicate that all the way. But first help people out. First make sure that they get the confidence that you're delivering well. And then you can bolt on the other aspects later. And then you can start to talk about more innovative approaches and all of the things that are really exciting to us. But I do think that currently in organizations, let's just get down to the nitty-gritty of delivering projects and delivering them well. Seems to be still a huge obstacle.
Yes, yes. And then how often would you say that when there is a project that is in need of a project rescue, how often would you attribute it to a lack of sort of a process-centric approach?
For the ones that I get involved in, most of them, so easily 80%, if not more, and that might also just be because I am only exposed to a particular sample of them, because that's the skill set that we're bringing. So there might be a whole host of projects that fail for other reasons, absolutely. But what I do tend to do is I first look at what have you guys produced. So they would have produced some sort of business case, maybe a description of project scope, a set of requirements, some process models, some value chain diagrams, would have engaged the vendor through a tender document. And I tend to just grab all of that and look at it and ask myself, how does this hang together? And if it doesn't, then I know something has gone wrong. But if it does hang together and I can clearly trace the work that's happening today back to something like a business case, then I say, okay, so maybe the work here, maybe there might be some gaps here, but that probably wasn't what caused the overall issue. And I guess the other aspect to that is often then a question of, especially in IT project delivery, the vendor capability and the vendor system capability, because sometimes the business, as we always say, right, they just go engage a vendor and you kind of have to try and make everything then work around that. In which case, again, the process-centric approach is hugely valuable, because maybe we can't influence that decision, but we can provide reassurance and we can provide transparency by saying, this is what your process looks like today. This is what it looks like tomorrow. There's a couple of things we would really like to be able to do, but we can't with the current technology and the current vendor. And then people say, yep, that's okay. We agree, right? Put it in your risk register, put it in your issues register. And that's all we have to do. That's all we're there to. We're not there to make decisions on behalf of anyone.
I guess a big part of it is giving that transparency and that visibility of where they're at and what's possible with what they have, and then understanding, well, what is the gap then from where they are currently, and what their ideal future looks like, and how can we close that gap, whether it's with capability or systems or different things like that.
Yeah, we had a big system implementation program of work we're involved in, and the vendor produced business process documents. And these business process documents were a reasonably high-level overview of where functionality of the system would be able to influence future state processes, and then a whole host of requirements. They had also written in a couple of future state roles, responsibilities, and more system configuration style stuff. But we then came in and we looked at that document, and there were some gaps in the document, and kind of scratched your head and went, oh, that's just not how I would approach it. There were some things missing, for example, an overarching view of the scope of the document. So you called something onboarding or recruitment, but the scope wasn't really clear, probably because, again, it wasn't a real process-centric approach. So all that we did was we looked at the description of the purpose of the document. And the purpose of the document was meant to be to provide an overarching end-to-end view of the future state business processes and associated requirements. And all that we did was take that purpose, go back and say, hey guys, we don't think that the document serves the purpose. Now, it doesn't mean we have to go back and do another 2 months worth of work, but it might mean we have to change the purpose of the document. So if you're saying that we will continue to flesh this out over the next couple of months, then that's fine, but let's please not claim upfront that this is the Bible of what we're going to be doing, which is then exactly what happened. So there were just some disclaimers put into this statement that then said that ongoing work, ongoing iterations to the document will occur. And it was exactly like you're saying, from that transparency and assurance perspective, to say, I don't want us to sign off on a document today that's got holes in it, because we know in the future that's going to lead to arguments and contract variations and change requests. It's going to cost you more money. So it's not about then bringing our thinking in and saying, we really think you need to spend another 2 months on this, but it's about being a little bit more pragmatic about that.
Yeah, great. No, that's good. And how do you think that different technologies can help us with, or what have you seen from your experience in terms of, from a technological point of view, that supports us with our project delivery? What is out there, and what are you using, and what do you think that it's maybe not a prerequisite for success, but it's certainly going to help the project achieve the outcome that it's aiming for.
It definitely depends on the maturity of the organization. So yes, we can deliver projects with Excel and Visio and Word and PowerPoint. And many times that might be totally appropriate as long as everyone signs up to the fact that we're going to create throwaway documents. They're going to live on a shared drive somewhere, on a SharePoint somewhere. No one's really going to use them. Then that might be okay. But more and more, we do see that organizations want to build capability through projects and programs. They don't want to create throwaway documentation. So that is when then better tools to manage your process models, your process architecture, and associated documents around requirements, business rules, then really kick in. And so obviously GBTech Speak, right, is one of those possible platforms. And it really starts to help when we start to produce documentation at scale. So if it's 2 or 3 people working on a program, you probably don't need it, right? That's a small enough team. You can work it out between yourself. But if you are looking at several people, call it 5+ working on a program, you're looking for consistency and you're looking for efficiency in delivery, that's when you need a proper tool. So if you try to run a SAP implementation with Visio and Excel, it's still possible, but it means inefficiency in your process because you're going to have to try and keep all of these things in sync. And then Philipp creates a model, it looks different to Daniel's, looks different to someone else's. And then the business comes back and says, oh, but why haven't you included this? So that's really where the tooling comes in and can help set ourselves up for success in the future. And so the same thinking that we apply to customers' processes, we need to apply to ourselves as well, right? What does a good delivery process looks like? And just like with every customer process, technology is a big part of that. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. And in the projects that you have been part of in delivering it, has there been anything that has come up that's been maybe a curveball or a surprise or something that you weren't expecting that you had to deal with, or a challenge or an obstacle that may not have been known beforehand? And how did you kind of tackle that? How did you approach that? How did you work with it or navigate that?
Yeah, we had a project and that was for a client in the, I'm going to call it broadly physical industry. So we're not talking services anymore. And the project was really looking at improving safety monitoring. So it was effectively about standing up a new center that would provide safety focused services out to various sites. The scope of the project was very clear. The purpose of the project was very clear. But the question of how do we do that? How do we stand up this new center changed many times. And it kind of went from let's go and use this super sophisticated piece of technology, a new system that can take all of this data and make automated recommendations, automatically communicate out to customers. That was the one end of the spectrum. And the other one was, maybe we just go and hire 2 people. They look at dashboards we already have today, pick up the phone and ring the customers if there's anything to talk about. So the question of how would we deliver the purpose changed multiple times, again, driven by budget conversations and driven by timelines. So we were initially working toward the bigger goal of saying, how do we now develop future state processes and requirements for a really sophisticated solution? And then we went back to, is there actually something we can do by the end of the year? Right? What would that look like? So it brought a little bit more of that, I suppose, iterative thinking into it. Also meant, though, that the work we had done on future state processes and requirements really had to change. We kind of had to park that and we had to go back to the purpose, right? So, okay, let's forget about the work we've done, but what are we trying to achieve here? And what does the accelerated way look like? I don't want to call it shortcut because it's not, but what is the quickest way to get most of the value actually look like? And then being able to articulate, if you do this, here's how much it's going to cost you, and here's what you're going going to get for it, and here's the associated risks, versus the original intent of the project. But that is certainly tends to be one of those moments where, when that direction change comes into the project or into the program, because of things that are happening outside of your own world in the organization, then everyone is just kind of looking around and going, oh, okay, we really need to quickly need to pivot here and make sure that we still, again, respond to what's relevant to the organization, right? So could have continued to work on our grandiose idea for a little bit longer, but if that's not what's needed, if that's not what the organization is after, then why would you?
Yeah, and I guess that would be a challenge for some people, spending such time, effort, and energy heading in one direction, and then whether it's budget cuts or for whatever reason, maybe there's something disrupting the marketplace in some way or another. It could be COVID, I'm sure, disrupted a lot of projects that were happening. So I guess it'd be hard sometimes to I guess hold everything that you have with open hands, to be like, hey, we need to be flexible here. We need to be able to adapt and be agile and change course if the circumstances, if the environment requires us to.
And I think restructures are just the best examples of exactly that. Depending on where in the organization a restructure happens, whether it is at a team level, at a business unit level, or maybe at the overarching whole of organization level, that is what tends to just completely grind delivery to a halt. Because we're all just humans at the end of the day, right? And if a big change like that rolls through the organization and we get caught up in it, then our headspace just isn't there to go back to, hey, can we chat about the next set of processes, right? Hey, can we chat about testing a new bit of system functionality? In the scheme of things, that starts to, it's not irrelevant, but it's just not what's on top of mind at that point in time. So yes, absolutely, restructures are the worst thing that can happen if you're trying to deliver a project. And obviously it's important in those situations. So even in that situation where we kind of were forced to go back to, suppose a bit more of an MVP style concept of delivery, it's important to not lose track of the original vision. So a lot of the innovative, creative work is always going to push the boundaries of what we are supposed to do or what we're allowed to do. And it's important to still do that. And it's important to try and plant that seed of, hey, what else could you be doing, right? How could you be doing this a lot better? What else could you be doing for your customers? That's really good. And oftentimes someone's going to look at it. It might not be straight away, but then later. So it's that difficult balance of, let's do something that's relevant right now, but not lose track of the overarching purpose and ideas.
Yeah. And then it's so important to have that very clearly articulated and communicated vision and purpose. Why are we doing what we're doing? We're not just doing projects for the sake of projects. We're doing this to get to an outcome, to see value delivered to the organization. And I think, it's when we lose track of that vision, when we lose sight of that vision and what we're actually doing, that's when you can go off course and you actually don't end up at the outcome that you're that you're aiming for. And I think it's, as you're talking about starting with or aiming towards that minimal viable product. What's the MVP? What's that the minimum that we can work towards to start with, so we can prove the value. We can show the value there. We can get some runs on the board. We can get some wins on the board. Because I think it, in some ways it goes back to that sort of 80-20 rule, that 20% of the effort and the time and the energy we put in is going to produce 80% of the results. So it's looking for, what is that core? What's that critical? What are the areas and the topics that we should be focusing our attention on to deliver the maximum amount of value for the effort we put in? Because I think that's crucial.
Yeah, and it gives you that track record of delivery as well. And there's nothing that's more important to the business than a track record in delivering. Everybody knows the situations where you're trying to convince the future customers of your project that you're there to do good for them, and they just sit back and go, oh yeah, it's another one of those. It's not going to go anywhere, right? Nothing is going to happen. Oh yeah, here's head office again trying to shove this down our throats, right? Like, everyone knows it. And that's why a track record in delivery is so important, because we can genuinely demonstrate, here's what you will get, here's when you will get it. hey, remember when we told you wouldn't get it, you actually got it. So here's the next little bit. Here's the next little bit.
Yes, yeah. And I think being able to communicate what you will get, I think that's so key. It's, every person needs to have these interpersonal communication skills, because as you say, we're all people, and we're all people that are working with other people. And, at the end of the day, we need to be able to, bring people on a journey and spark vision. Like, it doesn't matter where we are in the organization, we all are taking on a leadership role in some capacity, whether we're leading a wider team of people, whether we're leading just one other person, whether we're collaborating in a small group. We're there to make sure that we do what we say we're going to do. We achieve what we want to achieve, what we set out to achieve. And a big part of that is bringing people along that journey. So I think it's very, very important.
Huge shout out to everyone in change management and communications in those professions. Yeah, absolutely. An absolutely critical job.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think at the end of the day, I think it's, being able to execute on the strategy, that is a big part of what we're talking about here in this conversation. Being able to take these grandiose ideas and plans and what we're wanting to achieve in a project context, and how do we execute that? How do we make sure that happens? And we see that in every organization, across every part of an organization, and I think it's beneficial for us to learn from people like yourself, Phil, that have been there, done that. You've seen what's gone well, and you've seen what hasn't gone well, and you've been, I'm sure, been brought in many times to perform a process rescue. I think as you were talking about, all I could picture, all I could visualize was someone flailing about in the middle of the ocean and needing a life raft and a life vest. Someone to come along that has the required expertise, the required skills, the required resources to be able to rescue that project and what's going on. I just want to thank you for sitting down with me. I've certainly gleaned a lot in this conversation, and I want to encourage people that are listening to this that if you're in a situation at the moment where you're in a project and it needs a bit of rescuing, then there are people out there that can certainly help you and can steer you in the right direction, can get you back on course. And I think, as we've talked about today, a big part of that is aligning yourself back to the vision, back to the purpose, back to the why do we do what we do. So, Phil, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, always great to chat to you.